Today we're gonna compare cameras on the iPhone 14 Pro as well as the iPhone 13 Pro. This year's iPhone 14 Pro is very similar physically compared to the past 2 years. Most of the changes are refinements in the internals. And the camera system, of course, this year's Pro RAW on the iPhone 14 Pro shoots up to 48 megapixel compared to the usual 12 pixel that we have for years. However, there is a drawback whenever you're shooting at 48 megapixel with Pro RAW on the iPhone 14 Pro. The average file size is around 75 megabytes compared to 25 megabytes when you're shooting with 12 megapixels. So depending on the storage size on your phone, you might run out of space faster than expected. And maybe it's because of the large file size. When you're taking photos with Pro RAW on the iPhone 14 Pro, the shutter takes a while for it to load and then take the photo, which gives it a little bit of a delay there. And the night photography is supposed to be 2 to 3 times better than last year. So let's go ahead and start with this photo first. Both of these are shot in Pro RAW, and the left one is the 13 Pro and the right one is the 14 Pro. First thing you'll notice right away is the main camera on the 14 Pro now shoots in 24mm compared to the 13 Pro in 26. And if you take a look at the edge over here, you can see that very well that the 24 does capture a tad bit more in frame compared to the 13 Pro. Let's go ahead and zoom in closer to the clouds here. And I'm actually kind of surprised by the clouds because the 13 Pro looks very processed, like that sharp smartphone looking photo that we're used to. And the 14 Pro just doesn't have that. And this might be the biggest change I have ever seen so far with the 14 Pro 48 megapixel Pro RAW. The photo actually looks more close to my mirrorless camera, like using an actual camera and lens. And honestly, it feels more natural now. It actually feels more like a photo from a camera. Well, that's a pleasant surprise. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the JPEG photos from both of these phones. Again, we're using the main camera over here, and right away you'll see that the 14 Pro, it's a tad wider compared to the 13 Pro as expected. There's really not that big of a difference here if you're just shooting in JPEG. Alright, now this set of photos are both taken with the main camera, but both of them are in Pro RAW. And honestly, I feel like they look quite similar at first. If you're looking at this on the phone, you probably won't tell the big difference right away. But if you zoom in just a tad bit, actually no, that's like 400. Let's just do like 100, how about that? And you'll see that the tree feels more natural compared to the over-sharpened photos on the iPhone 13 Pro. Even though it doesn't look as sharp on the 14 Pro, but it still retains a lot of the details that you have in the photo. And again, the cloud gives it away that the 14 Pro just looks so much more natural. And look at this over-sharpened cloud up here on the 13 Pro. It's just unmatched. This is fascinating. Here's a set of ultra-wide shots with Pro RAW, and it looks a lot more similar. Again, the sky on the 13 Pro looks more saturated compared to the 14 Pro. And honestly, both of these photos look quite similar at first. And if we zoom all the way in, the ultra-wide angle seems to be not doing as a good job as the main camera on the 14 Pro. The cloud here looks a bit more over-sharpened, kind of like a smartphone look again. So it seems like if you really want to get that camera look, you have to use the main camera because the ultra-wide angle lens here still has a bit of over sharpening on the photos, especially on the clouds that you can tell right away. Both of these doesn't look very different. And in case if anyone's curious, there's also a 2 times on the 14 Pro, which is around 48mm, and that is very close to the 50, which I love to use all the time. The photo you're seeing here on the 14 Pro is shot with the 2 times zoom, and this is in Pro RAW. But essentially what it does is that it's taking the main camera shot, which is 24mm, and it crops in to look like a 50. So this photo itself is actually a 12 megapixel photo. But in a way, this is a clever way to add an extra focal length. I wouldn't say an actual focal length in this case, but an extra function, kind of like an extra camera without adding a physical camera in the phone. So because it's using the same camera here, we would expect the detail is not as sharpened, like a smartphone sharpened photo as expected over here. Yeah, the cloud looks a lot more smooth and natural compared to the over-sharpened photos on the left taken by the iPhone 13 Pro. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the 3x zoom on both of these photos here. Again, the 13 Pro has that very over sharpened look, and let's go ahead. If we look at the back over here, it feels like the 13 Pro has the clarity cranked up way too high. Here's some portrait shots taken with the main camera on both of the phones. So right away, the first thing I notice is this tree back here. The left photo has a lot in focus and doesn't have that bokeh feel compared to the right. The 14 Pro is definitely better at separating the subject from the background with the main camera. And in a way, that actually looks more like a natural bokeh whenever you're taking photos with the camera. However, if you look at the hair over here, I feel like there's more gray hair on the 14 Pro for some reason. Not very normal in my opinion. It's just, yeah, it feels like he has more gray hair, but he doesn't. Here's a set of photos in portrait mode. And yes, both of these photos are not exactly apples to apples, but what I'm looking for is the separation from the background. So if we take a look at both photos here, seems like the 14 Pro does a better job at the separation here. The 13 Pro here looks very fake. It's not exactly natural. So the roll-off feels more natural on the 14 Pro in a way. You see some part of the clothes is kind of like not in focus, but some is. Now let's get into the video side of it real quick here. There's not much difference so far. They only added cinematic mode 24 frames per second on the 14 Pro. And honestly, they look quite similar. You can still see that the cut off the hair, it's still kind of iffy, especially on the right glasses on both of the 13 Pro and the 14 Pro. And of course, we tested the action mode.
Excuse me, sir, do you have some time to talk about the new iPhone 14?
No, I'll pass.
It's okay. I mean, it's I just have a few questions for you. Have you seen the new iPhone 14, sir? Excuse me, sir.
Now, whenever you toggle on action mode, it automatically goes to the 0.5, which is the ultra wide angle lens. And you will notice that crop right away, so the footage looks more stabilized. But at the same time, the quality of the footage is not as good as whenever you switch to the main camera. So what I recommend is to toggle the action mode on and then choose the main camera. That way you will get a better quality footage. And yes, it's very stable. I would say it's pretty much on the level of GoPro or DJI. The selfie camera got an upgrade too. It actually focused now, which I actually never noticed before because I rarely use the selfie camera. But I would assume that a lot of people will benefit from the selfie camera being able to focus because you'll actually see more depth of field whenever it's focusing on your face. And that by itself actually makes the front-facing camera look better in my opinion. Here's some shot taken right around the sunset, more like the beginning of blue hours. And the 14 Pro doesn't look as bright, and especially in the shadows. Shadows looks darker in the 14 Pro, but it looks more smooth and less sharpened and noise. And if we zoom in over here, you can actually see a bit of a noise starting to introduce to the 13 Pro. And as for the 14 Pro, everything still looks quite smooth in the sky. Here's some night photos, and this one is taken with the ultra wide angle lens in ProRAW on both of the phones. And right away, I don't see much of a difference, even though it's supposed to be 2 or 3 times better. And then now we zoom in, the overall quality is just not that different. If you take a look at the ceiling here, you do see more textures and details on the cracks compared to the 13 Pro. But then we're like really pixel peeping here. It's not how most of us will view photos. Most likely we won't zoom all the way in and just look at small detailed textures like this. If you're just looking at both of these photos on social media, this is not that much different. Now here's another photo I took in a totally pitch black abandoned apartment. And both of these doesn't look too different, except the framing is different because I was kind of off on framing. Again, in a way, the leaves and the building looks more natural because it's not as over sharpened compared to the 13 Pro. After looking at all of these photos, I do see that the cameras on the 14 Pro does a better job compared to the 13 Pro. Especially that it doesn't look as much as a smartphone photo anymore, not as over sharpened. And the separation between the subject and the background looks more natural. The overall feelings of the photos taken by the 14 Pro does feel more towards the actual mirrorless or DSLR cameras, which is fantastic in my opinion. However, the night mode, it's definitely a bit of a letdown. If you don't or rarely shoots ProRAW, the difference is very minor. I wouldn't say it's worth the upgrade to the 14. And depending on which phone you're coming from, if you don't need some of the Pro features, you can definitely save a couple $100 from the other models and at the same time get great photos. And if you want to make your photos look better, you can always edit them or even slap on the presets like the one I have down in the description if you're interested. You can find more simple photos taken with these presets on an iPhone in the video right here. Until then, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.